Well, I hope you brought the user manual because for this 208, we are decoding data centers. Most people still aren't exactly sure what they are, so let's start there. Data centers are buildings that house servers, storage systems, networking equipment necessary for digital services, cloud computing, and artificial intelligence. Idaho code states that for a place to be considered a data center, the facility has to have one or more buildings that hold server equipment for the transmission and storage of data. It also has to have an uninterruptible power supply, generator power, or both, sophisticated fire suppression and prevention systems, and enhanced physical security and restricted access. Because there's a lot of personal information stored in these things. So that's the direct meaning of a data center, which means your data isn't actually in the clouds or disappears into thin air. It's in those big buildings filled with computers. And if you look around, there's actually more centers than you would expect for our area. Micron has a data center. There's ARC Data Center in Boise, Valor C3 in Boise, in Kuna you have Meta, and in Nampa you have T5. On the surface, they don't really look like much, just big buildings full of computers. But behind those plain-looking walls, there's a large appetite for electricity, water, land, and infrastructure. And right now, Idaho is starting to ask the same question communities across the country are wrestling with. What exactly happens when the digital world moves into your backyard? Well, that's what takes us to Bingham County, where we talked with Adam Young, who's asking questions about the impacts that these data centers will have on his family farm. Now, for background, he and his family farm about 2,600 acres of wheat, barley, and alfalfa. And what they grow gets watered with groundwater. So that means 100% of their operation is run on pumping well water out and onto the farm. So their electricity use is one of their top line items.
Electricity is consistently one of our top 3 expenses on the farm. It's usually number 2, just behind fertilizer. So it's a significant expense for us. We pay about $190,000 to $200,000 a year on electricity to pump water. It's a tremendous expense.
In the past 5 years, they have seen a 45% increase in electricity costs, which is why he's concerned about more data centers coming in. Young also points to a recent case involving Micron and the Idaho Public Utilities Commission, where Micron asked the commission to fast-track their contract with Idaho Power, which would determine what rates Micron would have to pay for their electricity. But there was a pause on that after an irrigation group brought up concerns over who would incur the cost of that electricity increase. That case is still playing out, but Adam says in other states, costs have skyrocketed for existing ratepayers because of these data centers coming in.
This last legislative session, I worked with Representative Stephanie Mickelson from Idaho Falls and with Representatives Dan Garner and Mike Veely on legislation to help ensure that that doesn't happen. The goal of that legislation is to ensure that those costs aren't shifted to existing ratepayers. Now, that legislation alone doesn't guarantee that those cost shifts won't happen. It provides a framework that defines who has to pay for those costs, but it still falls on us to do the assessments, to be involved, and to make sure that we agree with the calculations that have been made, with the analyses that have been done, and that those costs, in fact, are not being shifted onto those of us who are already on the system.
Okay, so coming up at 6 for Inside Ag, we're going to look at how Adam is taking preventative measures to hopefully lower that electricity bill. But there are still concerns over how much water is being used at these data centers and what that means for the scarce resource.
Ultimately, anytime we're talking about Idaho's water, we're talking about a resource that impacts all of us.
Now, Idaho is trying to get ahead of the curve when it comes to water usage in data centers, especially considering drought years like this one. Now, lawmakers have put a system in place for future water use. House Bill 895, which is now law, requires data centers to move to the state building a center that is designed for non-consumptive water use or access water through an existing user. It could be through a city, a water district, or sewer district. A center could also have a contract through an existing water user. So what's the difference between consumptive and non-consumptive water use? There's several methods to cool off these data centers. First up, evaporative cooling, which uses up the most aqua. Representative Britt Raybould says that uses in excess of 100 million gallons of water a year. So then you have the hybrid version, which is a little less wasteful. And then there's a closed loop system, which causes the least amount of waste out of the three options, which would be the best case scenario. So the message behind this law: if you want to come to Idaho, you need to be using one of our greatest resources responsibly.
Up till now, things have been fairly stable, but if we weren't to take into account what additional growth could do in the form of something like a data center coming in and wanting to make use of that water, areas that have traditionally not had problems could potentially find themselves in a serious situation. California has had areas of the state where, because they've pulled so much water out of their aquifer, the ground has literally compacted and dropped by several hundred feet. And so what we're looking to do is to ensure that our aquifer maintains itself as a storage capacity, has that storage capacity in the system. So you've got to maintain that balance.
So like we mentioned earlier, the limited resource of water is a concern for ag producers across the state. But it's not just about protecting farmers from water waste.
For most people, the closest they get to water policy is when they turn on the faucet in their home and the water comes out, right? They have confidence, they have certainty that they're going to have access to water. What this legislation does is increase the likelihood that they can have that certainty, because we are being thoughtful about about this water policy and this approach in the state. And all we have to do is look around at this past winter to see just how quickly we can go from having full reservoirs to having tight water years.
Now, Raybould says this is about being proactive, and it doesn't stop with House Bill 895. She says this will be a continued conversation for the future.